Alrighty. Okay, so the next couple of weeks, probably the next 3, really will be the romp of romps in terms of what we're trying to cover. So where we ended up last week was basically looking at largely Protestantism, the way Protestantism responded to the high age of empirical science and the Enlightenment in general, and the twin approach, I suppose, of addressing the challenges there. One, to come to terms with the fact that the Bible was not the sort of book that should be subject to empirical scrutiny, you know, where's the splinter from Noah's Ark, etc., because it's not that kind of literature. So that becomes a defence against empirical science. And then the other plank of all of this is, if we're going to say it's not that kind of literature, it's not historical, it's not scientific, what is it? It's religious literature, what does that mean? We have to kind of make a science, in a sense, out of religious literature. And so the whole era of biblical scholarship that, you know, and stops and starts kind of brings us up to the current era. And maybe in the last week it'll be worth just having a look at where that has reached with, you know, people like Bart Ehrman, for instance, guy you saw briefly in that Lost Gospels video a few weeks ago, the trendy young Anglican priest in the back of a truck through the Egyptian desert. And he actually, at Nag Hammadi, he actually meets Bart Ehrman. He's probably right out there as one of the leaders who's, you know, at the point where they just slice and dice every little word in the Bible and in any manuscript that looks like it might be biblically related and related literature, etc., etc. And that's probably precisely what Karl Barth was a bit worried might happen, that somehow we would lose the wood for the trees, so to speak. And so you get that bit of a reaction effectively towards the end of the century, into the 20th century. On the Catholic side of things, I mean, this does affect Catholicism inevitably, and particularly in the last century or so. But in the 19th century as such, Catholicism's kind of in a different space. It's kind of cut itself off from a lot of that set of concerns through the moves made in the Counter-Reformation in particular. It does have its own kind of response to the Enlightenment. You know, De Lamennais, that I quickly ran through, would be at the extreme end of that. There's other much more moderate efforts, I suppose, to come to terms with what the Enlightenment challenge is. But it doesn't kind of last all that long on the Catholic side in the 19th century, etc. And the reaction is pretty severe to kind of get that old Greco-Roman pyramid right back up where it needs to be. And the guy who I guess represents that best, and in some ways brings up one of the sides of the tension that Catholicism and probably Christianity in general still lives with today. Pope Pius IX, or Pio Nono as he's popularly called, the longest papal reign in the 2,000-year history of popes, quite a young guy, relatively speaking, when he's elected. He's a young, very well-educated member of the Italian nobility. He's very, very literate, you know, great person to wheel out if you're trying to impress. He has spoken and written quite a bit about the Enlightenment and the need for the Church to come to grips with this explosion of thought. And so for the moderates and the liberals in the Church, he's considered to be ideal to be the Pope to lead the Church in a sensible way through these challenges. And he begins really, really well. He liberalises a whole lot of things around the Vatican and the Papal States. The Vatican still owns tracts of land in and around Italy at this stage, the sort of vestiges of the old Holy Roman Empire in a sense. He speaks very moderately and calmly, and the need to, talk with those who, with whom we cohabit this planet, etc., etc. Quite radically, he liberalised a whole lot of the laws around the Jewish ghettos in the Papal States. And I mean, this is an interesting study in itself relative to what will happen in the 20th century. It bespeaks the situation that the Jews found themselves in both Eastern and Western Europe, that they were considered safest in ghettos, encampments, where they could be kept under control, and actually becomes a bit of a leader in liberalising some of these things. But within a couple of years, all of this sort of falls apart, and there's all sorts of speculation about exactly what happened here, from he had a nervous breakdown all the way through to, I suppose, more tangible sorts of reasons. The most likely is that he came face to face with a fairly rabid Italian nationalism, as well as the fact that, of course, he's surrounded as a pope, by very, very conservative Sir Humphrey kinds of people, who are always trying to pull, anything the slightest bit excessive back. But the Italian nationalism generally in Europe at the time tended to be pretty rabid. There were revolutions happening all over the place. Italian nationalism had a particular kind of passion to it. And, they were out to dismantle everything that represented the old pyramidical structures, state or church. They wanted, rid of the kings and the princes and all of that sort of thing. And certainly some of them wanted rid of the church, just scrap it, had its day, we know now, it's all of the past, we're better off without it. It's standing between us and all of those wonderful goals that Enlightenment thinking's put before us. And he seems to realise that here's a group that simply can't be talked with. So by 1850, he's actually re-establishing the Jewish ghettos because, rightly or wrongly, he associates, as tended often to be the fashion, trouble in the state, blame the Jews. So a lot of the Jewish establishments were seen as part and parcel of this push for nationalism, which was probably right. Why wouldn't they want change? And then in 1864, he actually says, this is a guy who, just 20 or so years before has been put in as the moderate, issues this thing called the Syllabus of Errors, which will go down in history as one of the most extraordinarily reactionary statements, promulgations ever. It basically condemns everything that the Enlightenment and 19th century advance were on about, from quite, maybe things that one might have reasonably been fearful of, communism, but, naturalism, rationalism, for God's sake. An absolute ramping up of Augustine versus Aquinas, another way of looking at it. Just squeezing that pyramid so tight, down here that it's condemned roundly by virtually everybody. I mean, the East just shakes its head and said, thank God we got it out of all of that 1,000 years ago. Protestantism, pretty much the same. Gladstone, the Prime Minister in England, who is a symbol of Enlightenment thought. Gladstone, I don't know if you've ever been up to Bangor, where his house is and his personal library he left to the state. One of the finest libraries, personal libraries in all of Europe when he died. So very much an Enlightenment man. And he actually, he calls it for whatever and says to English Catholics, listen, I'm sorry, but you just can't possibly support this and support the English state. These two things are just too opposed. Puts huge pressure on English Catholics and Catholics everywhere, really, in a sense. I mean, the way Gladstone speaks of the Syllabus of Errors and Pio Nono generally, it's a little reminiscent of how we would speak about North Korea and Kim Jong-il. You know, these are just so out of touch, a totally reactionary kind of rogue regime. There's no holds barred. It's a pretty bleak moment for, you know, Western Christianity's credibility. And then in 1869, almost as though, you know, no one's really taken much notice of any of that, the First Vatican Council is called just polar opposite kind of a council to the second one in terms of representation and, you know, ecumenism and all of those sorts of things. A very narrow little, pretty much an Italian kind of a show. It's too dangerous for people to travel anyway at this time. And then out of the Vatican Council comes the promulgation of papal infallibility, which even those very conservative cardinals, for the main part, didn't want to support it, even in the fashion in which it came through. And in the fashion in which it came through, of course, you know, there's so many caveats and qualifications, and in the end, it probably doesn't really mean all that much that, you know, in terms of rubber on the road. I mean, one of the few edicts or dogmas, supposedly, you know, in and around papal infallibility was in 1950 when Pope Pius XII declared that Our Lady had been assumed into heaven, body and soul, the Assumption of Our Lady. So, okay, you know, I guess I can live with that. I mean, who would know? Does it matter? You know, it's that kind of stuff, very ethereal kind of stuff that wouldn't matter. But of course, it creates an aura around the Pope. It was a real attempt to just squeeze the pyramid even tighter, put the Pope even further up. And, you know, 100 years later, when the Pope comes out and says Catholic women shouldn't take artificial contraception, in the minds of a lot of ordinary Catholics, you know, gee, the Pope's infallible, this must be infallible. It creates that kind of problem, I guess, that, again, you know, when we finally get into the plastic pants, that'll be one of the first ones that, that needs a jolly good look at. The work's been done, but of course it's pretty much suppressed. This one was quite beyond Augustine. I mean, Augustine couldn't have dreamt this one up. It really was the reaction of a church in crisis and receives even more universal condemnation than the Syllabus of Errors. In 1870, surrounded by the nationalists, Pio Nono declares himself the prisoner of the Vatican. It's a protest statement. Look, you know, once upon a time the Pope was the ruler of the world, and here I am now locked in Vatican City, and hot on the heels of that establishes this Peter's Pence as a way of financing the papacy and the Vatican internationally. Something that still happens today. Not for the poor, just to kind of support. Because once they lost the papal states, in particular, they had really no other source of income. So, I mean, that's kind of the, you know, pretty negative story. I mean, depending on your point of view, obviously there are conservative Catholics who think this was the grandest moment in the history of the church. You know, I think most people would be with Gladstone that it really wasn't. This was the church in retreat, and what did this have to do with Christianity anyway? I guess is the big question. So that's that side of the story, and if that's all that came into the 20th century, then, you know, at least it'll be clear. But towards the end of the century, following on from Pio Nono is Pope Leo XIII, who also was there for a heck of a long time. And he's, I mean, succeeding popes have to be careful what they say about the preceding one, but he clearly was a very different kettle of fish. There were a lot of people in the church, including cardinals, cringing as Syllabus of Errors and papal infallibility and that sort of stuff started to sneak through. I think, my God, you know, what next? He clearly was one of them. He's a true intellectual. He's an absolute Thomist scholar. He attempts, you know, none too subtly, to re-embrace a whole lot of the liberal thought and Enlightenment ideas, and says very explicitly that what we've said a few times in this class and what I've seen a few of you saying on your discussion boards, you know, if we'd sort of really taken Aquinas on board, an awful lot of this embarrassment wouldn't have needed to happen. And so, you know, gets Thomism going again in seminaries, etc., etc. Mind you, most of it's in Latin and still it's very selective Thomism, but at least, you know, he was onto the right idea. Interesting what, you know, down the layers people will do with a great thought like this. I mean, he was dead right. Aquinas clearly was the key. By the time you kind of get down to a little, you know, priest's seminary in Australia, a long way from this kind of grand thought. What that study of Aquinas has become is interesting. It's been tamed, it's been muted, it's in Latin, it's selective, and it doesn't have quite the punch. You know, the power of Aquinas to kind of break through, in my view, is still to come. Importantly, he takes the leaf out of the book of, you know, the big idea that's coming through in the Enlightenment about the need for human rights, social justice, etc., and promotes a social consciousness as part and parcel of what being Christian is about, and puts out a quite remarkable document for the time, and particularly as it's, you know, just a bit over a decade from the time that Pio Nono dies, called Rerum Novarum, which does address all manner of social justice issues, inequality issues, the issues of capital and labour, which Mike will talk a lot more about soon as a real 19th century kind of a 19th into 20th century issue, and suggests that, you know, both sides, capitalism and communism, which by that stage are starting to sort of line up, at least ideologically, if not in the, you know, state versions, against each other, really in a Christian context should be replaced by localised democratic socialism, as he calls it. You know, fundamental early style Christian communities where people really do, you know, look after each other. And so, you know, a whole lot of parties are formed. You know, a lot of parties in Europe are variously called, you know, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, etc. A lot of that sort of came out of this era. And that Christians must be involved. It's a sine qua non. There's no being Christian without being involved in the world around you and trying to solve practical justice issues. He also, very importantly, creates the first effective bridge with Protestantism in another encyclical, Providentissimus Deus, in 1893, in which, for the first time, a pope acknowledges some of the strengths of the Reformation. That, you know, the reformers shouldn't just be condemned, as we've tended to do, or reacted against, as we've tended to do. They reminded Christians of the importance of the Bible, and that was something that the Western Church had lost touch with. And so goes on to assert the importance of the Bible for Catholics as well as Protestants, and education in and about it, and importantly takes on board a whole lot of the biblical critical tradition that had started to develop in the 19th century, and says, you know, yes, Catholics do need the Bible. It's not just a Protestant thing. And as we found out this century, we need to understand what the Bible is. We need to be part of this biblical scholarship that's going on largely in the Protestant world. And he promotes the role of Mary, which is very interesting. It was very much an Aquinas thing, and again, very much, I mean, the Muslims are actually the experts on Mary. He sort of, through his reading of Aquinas, he comes up with a much more fortified notion of who Jesus' mother was, and sort of starts to talk about her in much more prophetic kinds of language. Okay, so into the 20th century, which is where we're going now. You've got Protestantism on the one hand, you've had that revolution, but then early in the century, you've got the very powerful influence, tempering influence to some extent, of Karl Barth, who is, one would have to say, fairly opposed to liberalism and a lot of naturalism. He's certainly not a naturalist. He's not an Aquinas scholar by any stretch, quite in another camp. Opposed to liberalism, not entirely, but in some of it's what he would have seen as excesses, particularly taking the Bible too far off the top of the pyramid and, laying it out on the base and slicing it apart. He really was frightened that everything would be lost, and he wants to re-establish if you like, the privileged status of the Bible as the way in which we receive the Word, and that is our main path to revelation. So he's kind of, definitely wanting to put that pyramid together again, if not, too exaggerated. Some people just jump on Barth, say, great, let's get rid of all this garbage thought we've had in the 19th century, get the Bible back to where it was. I just want to be able to open it and know what God's telling me today. There's no doubt that it did become, that some people, quoting Barth at least, justified going back to a more fundamentalist approach. His own position is much more subtle on that. He does, in fact, take on board a whole lot of the biblical scholarship of the 19th century, but inevitably does play some role, directly or indirectly, in the growth of 20th century fundamentalism on the Protestant side. A fundamentalism that has never been seen before. 20th century was, funnily, particularly after the wars and the Depression and everything, great era of fundamentalism. People get panicked, they go back to what they see as the safe way. And there were, the sort of southern evangelical kind of Protestant, not exclusively Protestantism, evangelicism, fundamentalism, if you like, that still all around us today. Any Sunday you could go there. It has not been a feature of Christianity over time. So the 20th century would be the era when, far from what Emile Durkheim said, everyone will be too educated, they'll understand too much, no one will want anything to do with religion. Well, to hell with that. They wanted religion, and they wanted it in the most simplified, literalist version they could find. It's the great enigma of the 20th century. And effectively, he does shore up Protestantism's essential Augustinian hierarchy. On the Catholic side, well, you've got Pio Nono on the one hand, you've got Leo XIII on the other hand, and then in the very early years of the century, Pope Pius X. Note, not Pope Leo XIV. Pope Pius X kind of says everything in a way. Not that he went all the way back to Pio Nono, because that would have been, beyond belief. So he continues the social reform movement of Leo XIII. It'd be pretty hard to turn around and say, well, that was wrong, Christians shouldn't care about the world. Continues promoting Aquinas, ? The words are there, but some of the taming, some of the selective work going on coming out of Rome after that. Aquinas, but, well, not that bit, he gets a bit radical there. Not that bit, just that bit, and in Latin. Make sure it's in Latin so they don't understand it too much. But, quite roundly rejects a whole lot of modernism and liberalism. Reasserts very, very strongly that the only real revelation comes through the church. Bible, yeah, but it's the church. It's the tradition of the church. Let's get back to that good old Platonic, Augustinian peaked thing, because that's where we feel safe. And hence effectively sets the scene for the other kind of fundamentalism that will be so strong, particularly in the later part of the century after the wars and the depressions. And that's something we're still kind of living through at the moment. And in a sense helps to shore up Catholicism's essential Augustinian hierarchy. And so from here there's two things that we want to do mainly around the 20th century. One is to look at the effects of communism, Marxism, etc., and how theology responded to that, and then fascism and how theology responded to that.
There's a little poem up there, well, the first verse. From a great friend of the left. People forget Henry Lawson had a Norwegian background. I'll let you just meditate on those first words. Sorry to those on a line for all the dingle dangles. The chatter of the streets. They lie, the men who tell us, for reasons of their own, that want is here a stranger and that misery is unknown. For where the nearest suburb and the city proper meets, my window sill is level with the faces in the street. Drifting past to the beat of weary feet, while I sorrow for the owners of the faces in the street. All of what Terry has just described, this movement from the 19th century into the 20th century, it's been conveniently forgotten that we're talking about humanity. It was Aristotle who asked us, let's take humanity seriously. For all our theories, all our religions, all our theologies, all our philosophies. We're left with those faces in that remarkable street. A colleague of ours shared that, reminded me of that remarkable image that things haven't changed, 1955 Collins Street. I'm always enthralled by the image of Paul Keating there, John Hewson, Malcolm Fraser. There's even a Kevin Rudd there. 1955. Yes, dear Henry. I'll return to Henry. Probably we'll get to him by next week. He won't mind. I go to his grave at Waverley Cemetery once a year. Special spot. Beautiful piece of real estate. His private property. Terry's alerted to us continually over the weeks, and I've touched on the theme, but I've decided to go almost manic. I've gone almost Egyptian with my pyramids, reaching to a enlightenment, to understand the political philosophies and theologies. However things change, they remain the same. Because as human history developed in the last 2,000 years, 2,500 years, from the Greeks, and would you believe, just after I put that PowerPoint together, a dear colleague of mine said to me, you should have mentioned the Egyptians, Michael. Well, the philosopher kings, the citizens, and then the slaves, yes. The Romans, as Terry and I've inferred over the weeks, adopted Greek philosophy in the Platonic sense of having Caesar, the senators, and of course your own understanding of history, you might challenge putting the army and citizens there, but the slaves, the proletariats, the lowest of the low. In Indian parlance, the untouchables. The church developed that Greek-Roman construct to that structure that we see there today, or yesterday, or last week, or since Nicaea. Pope, bishop, priests, and the laity. But history does not stand still. Again, those of you who are history students will be aware of the whole complex nature of European history relating to kings, queens, emperors, the feudal lords, and yes, those images of dark and grey and the serfs. things moved along apace. Probably the incestuous nature of the royal families of Europe wanted to spread the shame and pain. The aristocracy, the landlords, the servants. In a tutorial, I'd asked the history students to come and put some dates on this. But what happened with the Roman Church, the Roman Catholicism? No, same structure. Pope, landlord bishops, feudal lord priests, and the laity, yes, as willing servants and, yes, serfs. I might have shared with you, I still have that image of the Irish workers coming up that hill there from Woolloomooloo up to St Mary's Cathedral. The writers of history will always remind us of that beautiful French, the bourgeoisie. But the most interesting group, and here we see the beginnings of, dare I say, ourselves, the traders and the merchants, and even students of Jewish culture and tradition would have an interesting insight. Those Shakespearean scholars amongst us would also know the Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare was a little bit anti-Semitic himself, but that middle group, traders and merchants, they needed the workers too. And as it developed through the 19th and well into the 20th century, the capitalists, middle classes and proletariat. Yes. I love that word. Rome, again, as Terry has just showed you, in that context, that slide, you've just had the first 15 minutes of Terry's lecture. The church reactionary, but its basic structure is still the same. Society in general, the colonial powers just maintained that. Capitalists, the middle classes and the proletariat. Today, fast forward to today, the global economy hasn't really changed. Margaret Thatcher, there's no such thing as society, only an economy. Consumers, the working poor, the working students, the poor students. But of course, with the world village as it is now, we've actually seen post-colonial, post-European colonial world, we've actually seen the developing world slowly try to get onto its feet, kick down, slowly get back up again, kick down again. China and India will probably have a say about your superannuation. That's a pretty depressing scene. I don't make any apologies for it. People don't like seeing our own history, let alone a 2,000-year spread. History just points to questions and more confusion. But a little bit of help for us in this 21st century. I keep shaking my head when I use the phrase 21st century. I'm just a leftover from the 60s and 70s, I suppose. What was the 19th century response to a lot of the social and political order of the day? Well, the major one we're asked to focus on today, because of its intimate relationship with European world history now, but theologically, the relationship between what is known as communism and Christianity, particularly the Catholic Church, and interestingly the relationship between the Soviet state and the Russian Orthodox Church is worth a little view too, but we mightn't have time for that. But before communism, we must focus on a philosopher, a remarkable man in a sense for his influence, but a lot of people just see Karl Marx, Marxism, socialism, move on. Maoism. But no, been expelled from Prussia, France, this remarkable German Jew did find refuge in Gladstone's England. And the remarkable thing about that England was a welcome refuge, somewhat like a country like Australia has been for many people over years. But a great colleague, Friedrich Engels, also found himself in England, but not in exile. His father was a leading German industrialist, and he sent young Friedrich over as an agent to Manchester, the centre of industrial revolution in England. So interestingly, two men collided. I think that's a future novel or a future play, how those two men forged their relationship to eventually publish what became the Communist Manifesto. In that year, that history tells us, is right there in the centre of the 19th century, the year of revolutions, 1848. But you can't say that Marx didn't warn us what was going on. They were honest to the tip of their pen. Communists everywhere should support every revolutionary movement against the existing, the important words there I've highlighted in black, the existing social and political order. They were awakening those who cared to read or hear what they were saying, that there was something tragically wrong with the existing social and political order. Some would argue, as I would, 2,500 years of something wrong with the existing social and political order. His real breakthrough was to name the economic and social forces at play here. Information is power. These men wanted people to think. And there are lots of examples, but one of the finest examples, which again I'll fast forward to our own personal circumstances, is what Marx called brilliantly the false consciousness of private property. Now, what do you mean by that, Michael? Well, in a remarkable way, psychologically and sociologically, we still need to discuss this at every level. He saw private property as alienating the worker from his produce, from her art, from her trade, from his trade, and from her true self-worth. Please explain. Today, in a simple psychological meeting with your tax agent or meeting with a real estate agent or working out your inheritance, it's sad, but it is a psychological reality. You're owned by, you might say, oh, the bank owns my house. Well, that bank owns you or your debt, and they'll follow you to your grave. The significance of that is that Marx said we've got to get off our backsides and do something. And it required an ongoing political commitment to action, or that beautiful word, praxis. He was demanding the working classes take seriously and take back control. If ever they had control, well, they did in a certain sense in feudal times, of the means of production. And yes, he named it, needing to take over both the political sides of things. In doing and saying all of that, he would have looked around, and his rich Jewish tradition would have helped him focus with those famous words. That he saw that religion, particularly in response how Terry's lined out syllabus of errors and such like, wow. It was just absolutely suppressing the people, keeping them down to the bottom of that pyramid. And the tragedy of that is that Marx saw all human understanding through the history of class struggle in which he saw the church siding with the aristocracy and wealth. But the interesting insight is the understanding that history, not itself, but to change history, and he certainly did that. He used history as I'm using here to paint the canvas, but say, we certainly must change history. Or, as many different versions of this, if you don't know your history, you're cursed to relive it. Those who don't live by their history. But before Marx and communism, it's interesting for us theologically to look at the actual philosophy behind. And the remarkable man, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, stands out as the philosopher's philosopher. I love that 1770, the year James Cook sailed up the east coast of Australia. This philosopher's philosopher was born. A young man, very young man, became professor of philosophy in Berlin. His major works in that order is significant. Those of you who are interested in art and art appreciation, that first text on aesthetics was remarkable in the fact that it actually pointed out the human capacity to perceive beauty and light and love and colour. And the history of art, the aesthetics, taught him something of both history and the human condition. And remarkably, he gives the game away. Philosophy, religion, he was still worried why something as intellectually and emotionally and spiritually demanding and as important to some as religion. He wanted to know its own history. But history itself had to be studied in the history of philosophy. But what was coming, if you read Hegel and see his life stories and the different interpretations, he constantly was focusing on history. Those of us who love history, those of us who have forgotten our history, or those who wonder why we have to teach it, Hegel would be a great place to start. Because deep down, he saw that there was with philosophy, in the history of philosophy, philosophy itself, starting with the Greeks, could penetrate deep. If he had been open to indigenous spirituality, he would have known concepts like the deep down thing, as we're told by a culture of 40 to 50,000 years, that deep down thing. Hegel himself was into this. Deep down inside us, in nature, there is absolute being. And it's not a substance or incarnational. Hear the bells of religion here. But he saw, for the first time you see up there on that slide, the word process. Those of you who have done a bit of philosophy, we'd branch off then into the area of process philosophy and process theology. And look at the work of Whitehead. But no, there's always a tension here. And the tension was, again, you can see the foundations of a future break with Christianity and religious tradition. Not so much throwing the incarnation or the baby out with the bathwater, but at least trying to look at what can be done just with the bathwater. Hegel held Christianity in high esteem because in the simplest, most glib expression, he saw it as a remarkable religion of the spirit, the ascetic, the meeting of the intellect and beauty. But he saw it could easily be replaced all concepts of religion, faith, structured churches could be replaced with a structured philosophy of the Spirit. But this required a process, and this is the remarkable insight which even eventually Marx will take on board, turn it upside down a little bit, and then history will have a go. But Hegel developed the dialectic of thesis, antithesis and synthesis. It's at the point where a lot of us have had to say, hang on, what's going on here? And we quickly move to the end result, but forget Hegel. What I mean by that is we're left with this dialectic principle that human development, progress, results from ongoing clashes of opposite forces. Many philosophers would stop there and say, well, what do you mean by development progress? A lot of theologians would say, yes, where is basically your understanding of the future development of humanity or transcendence? No, that's to misread Hegel. Hegel, and later on Marx, was just asking for once to stand back and just look at the result of the clashes of opposite forces. In this, Hegel actually was going right back, pre-Socrates, to a dear friend of ours from earlier lectures, Heraclitus, that life is in the tension. Hot, cold, calm, action. That tension, that flow in the stream. But the tragedy of all tragedies is the emphasis is still on. We first have a clash of ideas or tension, which we then race in to resolve and have that synthesis. And this, of course, gives rise to new forces. The clearest example of that is itself, sadly, the history of the German states or Germany. And the history of all of what I've just described to you is still dismissed as materialist, German romanticism or German idealism. But history of the 20th and 19th century doesn't let us off the hook. It demands us now to take what Hegel was presenting and actually see where Marx used Hegel and then where others were eventually going to use the whole structure of the whole relationship between capital and labour. And I just will close before we just have a little break for, say, 5 minutes, is Hegel rewrote the master-slave relationship. The slave goes to find dignity in that relationship. I love my work as a student, as a teacher. Sadly, the masters in all those pyramid structures, that Platonic structures, the master finds, like the Pope does and the priests and bishops, or as a priest said to me once, the church is pretty silly when it's empty. The masters need the slaves more than really the slaves need the master. Country dioceses and parishes prove that to me. Masters lose, and this is history. We were laughing before about the Tudors. The whole history of the Tudors is masters lose dignity in this relationship and are enslaved by the dependency on and fear of everybody, but especially the proletariat. That's why castles are built. In the hands of Marx, this was to become the model of class struggle. So the intriguing thing for me is we have this false sense of understanding of the relationship between capital and labour, between the aristocracy and the middle classes and the workers. At its heart, it became a pure model for class struggle that we ourselves today find ourselves in. And I couldn't really say this up until a lot of this lecture. I couldn't even really galvanise until the worldwide financial crisis because you'd just be left with the theory of the conflict of the synthesis of the thesis, antithesis and synthesis. And just to recap before we just have a little break, every time in your own life when you come to make a decision, you're confronted with the knowns or the known unknowns or the unknown knowns. You'll develop a thesis. You'll find quickly, intellectually, and quite often socially, there'll be somebody with a counter view. In a civilised society, you'll be able to actually discuss and civil discourse before civil strife. We strive for, in ethics, civil discourse. And you lead on to that synthesis. But I'm afraid that's not where it ends. It was funny how the slide number 19 came up there. The 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right through to the 21st century. We have that conflict today. So we want to have a little break for 5 minutes and gather your thoughts. So there again, as I said, it's just the general outline of the thesis, antithesis, and the movement to a synthesis. How does this work in history? Well, the perfect example of it is the history of class struggle of the 19th century, where you basically had that structure again of the capitalist society, going back to the pyramids, became dominated by the bourgeoisie into French Revolution is a fine example of this. And the bourgeoisie, they started governing through parliaments, democratic or otherwise, and the otherwise is very much, we could branch off into questions of voting rights, the emancipation of women. Interesting thing that came around with the election of Barack Obama is that America would accept an African-American president before they'd accept a woman. And that sent the sociologists in the United States back into a tailspin where they discovered that African-American men had the vote before white women. An interesting tale of democracy or otherwise. However, the workers themselves, the proletariat, the proletariats, they did have an awakening and aware that they were being exploited, as some of us in this very room would feel that we might be being exploited by the system today, but particularly by laissez-faire capitalism. And the remarkable thing was that that tension, the thesis, antithesis of capital and labour, can quite easily live in that tension like in parliamentary democracies, can live quite well within trade union movements. But the synthesis isn't always a good news story. And again, it goes back to what do you mean by progress? Well, Marx certainly knew what was happening. Hegel, well, he didn't live to see this, but there was a synthesis of that can be referred to as totalisation. The total conflict of opposing forces just become so stressed, such a conflict, such a force, that you will have capital and labour resulting in totalitarian dictatorships, both of a fascist and communist ilk. The interesting word there isn't totalitarian, is that totalisation that can become part of a synthesis. Now, I know a person who's actually writing a PhD who has actually got some intriguing insights into totalisation. Dan, would you like to where have you shared in your writing?
Very rare that a PhD will actually apply to anything, so I'm very grateful to be able to speak very quickly about this because I don't want to take your time, Mike. What Mike's been talking about there with a thesis and then antithesis is the reality we all live in as theologians, and I suppose what we're building up here is a framework for understanding theology's place in the world today. And with a framework like this and with a course like this, you've probably realised along the way that theology is always so influenced by the context out of which it develops. And we just can't get away from that. The problem is, for theology, always, and I'd say it's a problem for every discipline, is when we forget that and we pretend that whatever theology we come up with, whatever philosophy we come up with, is everything. And we're not willing to even acknowledge. We have our thesis, and we're not willing to acknowledge any antithesis to that, and therefore unwilling to engage in any constructive debate with any other perspectives, unwilling to learn, and unwilling to change the position from which we're looking. Now, there's a couple of you, anyone who sends me an email typically gets a quote from this philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, just because it is a PhD thesis. And when you do a PhD, as I'm sure some of you in this room will do one day, when you do a PhD, you get a bit of tunnel vision and you see everything through the kind of paradigm of whoever you're talking about. But Levinas had a great way of talking about this phenomenon, and he called it totalization. He spoke about it specifically in terms of human people. So any philosophy or theology that comes up with an idea of the person and puts the person in a box and says, this is all you are, you'll never change, my view of you is complete. You create what he calls a totalization. You create a box in which you put something which probably doesn't belong in a box. It's always bigger than the box. So you apply that to the social sphere, and you get what Mike is talking about here. You get two very different movements, both of whom are refusing to engage with the antithesis, and so make themselves up as very strong, very rigid, unopen to anything else, and the inevitable consequence of that is some sort of violence. Here we see it come out in different sorts of physical violence, but you also get, I think, a theoretical violence. Why? Because you don't have the capacity to take on board any other view. You put things into boxes, and it's a good way of describing all of those theologies we've talked about along the way, which have been so concerned with building up their own pyramids. They've created totalizations. So I leave that one with you. If you want to look up, or if you want to talk about Levinas, I'm more than happy to do that on email, on the phone, or whatever. It's the only thing I know about at the moment. But it's an interesting way, and have a look up his philosophy, because he talks about the other person. He says the other person is a mystery, and to create a totalization of the other person is a profound violence. Well, I think if what theology has said throughout the ages about the transcendent, the numinous, the spiritual, as being other, bigger than, then theology has to be very careful of totalization as well. So I won't take any more time of yours, Mike.
The interesting thing, I'll just leave that on there. The answer to this, of course, in the 20th century was, of course, capital moved very quickly within Italy first, and Terry's going to touch on this in a few moments, National Socialism, which was basically, by the way, the nationalising of capital and industry, and it developed in Italian and German fascism. Directly at the same time, or thereabouts in reaction to purely political issues relating to the First World War, the Bolsheviks, with Lenin, state control of the workers and industry, and of course that developed in communism. The writers and if people such as Hegel were referred to as the skeptics. One of the great theatrical skeptics was a man who eventually became the public face of Fabian socialism, George Bernard Shaw. And I've actually stood in the very room where he wrote these words in 1944 with Allied bombers and German bombers flying over above. He used to play Mozart once the bombs started striking. I tinkled on the piano. A lovely description of a frightening time in your parents' grandparents' life. But the history just drips not only blood, but what Dan was just mentioning about totalisation. Anglo-American capital combined with communist Russia to destroy German and Italian fascism and capitalist imperial Japan. How did that happen? Well, we'll ask somebody who were you around at this time, Terry? Or?
Only in the 20s. Rude fellows. Yeah, so just to take up what was on the left-hand side, but probably if I could stand here and face you, I'd say more properly on the right-hand side as against the left-hand side. This whole fascinating connection with fascism and Christianity. You know, probably the lowest moment in some ways in 2,000 years of Christianity played out in the 20th century. We saw, you know, the inclination towards this. Protestantism, Catholicism makes no difference. The East probably did best in modifying this kind of, but, you know, who cares about the East? They're way down in the East. And particularly coming out of the 19th century with some of the sort of high liberal thought, the tendency on the part of establishments, Protestant and Catholic, to kind of shore this back up again. So what's fascism? It's built on the notion of, you know, all power being to an elite. Fits rather nicely. The elite is always chosen, selected to rule for the good of the whole, the state, you know, well, someone has to do it kind of thing. You know, pity, you know, I just happen to be up here and you're down there. Too bad. The elite is inherently superior, others inherently inferior, and in graded fashion. And there always seems to be, with the fascist kind of ideology, some, you know, punitive victims, some who represent the real bête noire that have to be subjugated, if not eliminated, for the good of the state, a kind of a common enemy. Great way for all of this mob up here to kind of gang up against, you know, someone down here. Great way for the ruler to, you know, divide and conquer. There's someone down here in a totally vulnerable state that becomes the kind of the boogeyman. I mean, quite clearly classical. I mean, it's Platonism, Augustinianism at its grossest. And fascinatingly, in the middle of the 20th century, the centres of fascism, probably like the world's never known it, I mean, it's debatable. If you go back to the Visigoths and whatever, but certainly in anything like we'd call modern times, the grossest demonstrations of fascism, right in the centre of Christianity, in Italy, you know, the home of Roman Catholicism, and Germany, the home of the Protestant Reformation. Maybe not accidentally. Mussolini in Italy, of course, and Hitler in Germany, both great admirers of ancient Greece and Rome, you know, words spewing out from both of them about those wonderful characters back there. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, you know, had a vision for taking over the world. They were their fascist heroes, didn't care about democracies or welfare or, you know, however many slaves they could take, the more the better, as long as they were prepared to work for nothing, and set them as their you know, models, their goals. And interestingly, both of them, and I really do think when you look at their writings, it's not just, now who have I got to get on side? Well, clearly I've got to get the church on side or this isn't going to work. No doubt a measure of that. But these both were ideologues of a sort and surrounded by ideologues. So there was more to it than just pragmatics. You know, in some ways these were not very pragmatic characters. In the end they fell over because they weren't pragmatic enough. They were ideologues. They worked on ideas. And both of them saw Christianity in its various forms as an ideology that would understand exactly what they were about and indeed support it. Why not? Because Christianity had supported all other forms of despotism over time, so why wouldn't it support them? And each of them employ, you know, very cleverly in a lot of ways, various Christian theologies to justify their actions. History of Mussolini and the Catholic Church. Well, he seals this concordat, this agreement with the Church in 1929, and actually uses the language of healing papal wounds. The wounds that were inflicted on the Pope back there in 1869, 1870, and before, you know, the Papal States were ripped away and the Pope, you know, was taken down off his pedestal and made a prisoner of the Vatican, and you know, oh dear, they were terrible times what those nationalists did, you know, to the wonderful Pope. And you know, we're going to heal all of that and assure the place of the Church in this new Italian order that's being envisaged. So obviously, you know, he's a good guy, gets the Church right on side. Mussolini it's declared by a number of theologians and church authorities that he possesses this thing called a spiritual anti-Semitism. Understands truly the scourge that the Jews have been to Christianity over 2,000 years. You know, that's why we had them in the ghettos, because they're a dangerous, insidious force. And any amount of Christian theologies, you know, I mean, as I showed you at the time of the Protestant Reformation, they became most explicit. Most of the reformers had this very kind of strong anti-Semitic theology, and it was a theology, but it had always been there. And Mussolini kind of taps this and theologizes about the need to, you know, keep the Jews under control. Described by Pope Pius XI as being sent by Providence. What better endorsement do you want than that if you're looking to, you know, have the church on your side? Hitler and the Christian churches, because, I mean, in Italy, it's mainly the Catholic Church. Obviously, it has to be brought on side. In Germany, it's kind of divided between, in those days, Catholic and Lutheran. So, you know, Hitler gets to work on both sides, but interestingly, he takes a leaf out of Mussolini's book, uses the Concordat that's been signed in Italy to do the same. Basically just replicates it, and then other agreements follow with other churches. And Hitler is quoted as saying, "There's never been anything more grandiose on the earth than the hierarchical organisation of the Catholic Church. I transferred much of this organisation into my own party." What an endorsement of Augustinianism. He himself refers to Catholic and Protestant clergy as my theologians, or in fact often in the third person. One can hear it in his speeches. Hitler's theologians. And Hitler's theologians are out there doing a wonderful job of, you know, preparing for this great Reich that will rule the world like the Roman Empire, like the Greek Empire. And uses, you know, all manner of Christian theology to justify anti-Semitism. And Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the Gestapo, develops what is referred to as a theological anti-Judaism, a bit like Mussolini's spiritual anti-Semitism. And indeed, you know, as pointed out a few weeks ago, uses Luther very, very freely to justify the policies of basically extermination. Okay, and just before we go on to that then, I thought it might be worth just having a little look at this, that if you don't believe me.
Just for the onliners who are listening, there'll be a link to this YouTube on the
So we'll go on to talk about Bonhoeffer a bit more, but I mean, you can see the religious kind of imagery, the religious aura of all of that, and certainly the pyramid well and truly in place. And people kind of look back and they say, how could that happen? How could well, take note in these elections that have just been held both in France and in Greece. Apart from, I mean, in France they've delivered a socialist president. Part of the reasons why they delivered a socialist president was that the neo-Nazi party would not support Sarkozy because he was not right enough for them. So they're punishing the right party, the right-hand party, for not being rightist enough, and going to let the socialists try and cope with the mess in the hope that in fact next time the people will turn even further to the neo-Nazi. And the biggest single winners in Greece was the neo-Nazi party. So as Europe sort of sinks into another crisis, just keep watching. Some of the a little bit to one side, but the banning of the burqa in France and Belgium, I mean, extraordinary things, enlightened Europe, and women can't dress the way they want to. And because there's all sorts of plausible things put around that. Well, what if they're carrying a bomb, or what about bikies, and what about nuns, and what about, I mean, in winter, walking down Paris, you can't see anyone's face anyway because they're all... And then, of course, now it's not just the burqa, but you've got gangs running around dragging, the veil off Muslims. And last week in Brussels, there was a little 70-year-old Belgian woman who had her scarf ripped off and some, oaths around being a Muslim. She's not a Muslim at all. Slippery slope. Once you get it sort of into that slightly fascist kind of thinking that there's an elite and there's a vulnerable underclass that are a threat to us, and a great distraction for politicians. Can't solve the financial crisis, let's ban the burqa. Oh, really good. It's going to really help. Anyway, it was the moment of great shame. It explains an awful lot of what happened then in the second half of the 20th century, politically and otherwise, but theologically it shaped a lot of the theology that would come out of the Second World War, and this guy, and he just keeps on coming back, probably never more significant than now in the 21st century as a sort of a architect of interfaith theology. That's another story. He's the leader of the theological resistance, who very quickly unpicks all that fascist theology that allowed, supported the Third Reich. And he sees so much of it centering on the issue of the Jews, that the fascists made so much of the issue about the Jews. They rested so much of their alliance with the church on a fundamental theological kind of anti-Semitism, using, none better in Germany than Martin Luther, the great hero, to support it. And we've really got to, as Christians, we've got to get past this one, that somehow or other the Jews are an underclass, that they're forever being punished, for having been the ones who put Christ to death on the cross. And calls it for what it is very early on, as early as 1933. I mean, it's quite remarkable when you think of it, a 26-year-old taking on an establishment like that and being able to find the words and find the theology for it. and eventually, we'll look again at this in the last week, comes up with the notion of a really, the whole infrastructure of Christianity is so lost any credibility. The religious form of Christianity can no longer carry it. It's so disreputable after what it's been so easily able to be used to justify in the Holocaust, that we need now a religionless Christianity. If Christianity is to survive, it has to take a radically different form, what he describes as a religionless form, and we'll look at that a little more closely. But essentially it's the basis of a new kind of interfaith theology that will allow all people of faith, and indeed non-faith or atheists, if you like, to see this supreme force as Lord of the world. Van Buren, I'll just take a random little sample here of how some of this post-Holocaust theology has developed into a kind of an interfaith theology that's capable of dealing with some of the big issues of the world. Shameful as it is to confess it, more than one Christian leader was able to absorb the Holocaust into our traditional theology of the Jews as wandering, suffering, despised souls, paying forever for their stiff-necked rejection of Christ. That became Christian theological anti-Semitism, and without that, really, Hitler would not have, at least so easily, been able to do what he did. Gregory Baum, the Church wants to clear itself of the anti-Jewish trends built into its teaching. A few marginal correctives won't do. It must examine the very centre of its proclamation and reinterpret the meaning of the gospel for our times, including finding accommodation between Judaism and Christianity, the connection. It becomes that new interfaith connection, the beginnings of a true Abrahamic theology, if you like, for the new era. And James Carroll, while Judaism exists without essential reference to Christianity, the reverse is not the case. The God of Jesus Christ, therefore of the Church, is the God of Israel. This fits rather nicely with, of course, what people are coming to see through their biblical scholarship, their increasing biblical scholarship, that quite clearly, Jesus was a Jew himself. It wasn't like that's just that he was killed by the Jews. He was a Jew himself, and a good Jew. He wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew, and there's no understanding who the heck he was, other than understanding what Judaism is. So at least that first bit of the connection, if not the next bit of the connection in the Abrahamic faiths, is starting to be put in place in late 20th and into 21st century theology. Martin Braverman, revisionist Christian theology, and this gets into very interesting new territory, an interfaith theology that can start to see the connections between the mistakes that were made then and the mistakes we're making now. That, some of the theology is such a corrective of the old anti-Semitic theology that it's become, yes, supportive of Judaism and seeing that connection, but at the expense of becoming anti-Islamic. And so setting the Muslim up as the new underclass that we'll all gang up against and leaders will distract themselves from their true duties by turning into the bogeymen. Revisionist Christian theology that emerged following the Nazi Holocaust attempted to correct the legacy of Christian anti-Semitism. In the process, it's fostered an unquestioning support of the State of Israel that undermines efforts to achieve peace in the region. There's now a tendency towards a blind spot in Western Christian theology and Western Christian politics, of course, towards, the case of the Palestinians, as, after all, the ones who were there first. And Wilbert Brueggemann, this ideology of land entitlement serves the contemporary state of Israel, enacted in unrestrained violence against the Palestinian population. The modern state of Israel has effectively merged old traditions of land entitlement and the most vigorous military capacity thinkable for a modern state. These are all theologians putting their head around that burning issue of the Middle East and suggesting that Yeah, theology can't stop with finding the accommodation between Judaism and Christianity. It really has to be a meeting point for all of the Abrahamic faiths if it's to be a useful tool in sorting out what the hell is going on there and finding some kind of accommodation that all can be content with. Rosemary Ruta, a new covenant is needed, one that will break the logjam of conflict and allow all the inhabitants of the land to live in freedom and security, a covenant in which Jews and Palestinians can acknowledge each other's pain and achieve a compassionate sense of co-humanity, being together, the children of Abraham. And Martin Braverman again, what can be the nature of the relationship between the faiths today that's faithful to the best in each and that can carry us forward in our shared commitment to justice? If we'd have a new shared covenant, it must be one that does not look backwards to the archaic and painful past, but forward to a day when justice will reign. These are all examples of theologies that tend to bounce off that event of the Holocaust and that gross time when Christianity was used as a tool for, the most glaringly awful fascism that the world's probably ever known.
Just move stage left. The church's response. During the European wars of the 20th century, simply summed up, the church's response was self-survival. It's an excuse for the church's lack of action in Nazi Germany. And the history of the church in Italy itself under Mussolini, and then later when at war's end when the Germans themselves invaded Italy. Especially after the Second War, intriguingly, we have what is known as the Cold War, which particularly developed once the Soviet Union, Russia, developed its own nuclear war heads. There was literally that nuclear standoff. But it permeated Western culture, particularly here in Australia. At the roots of the left in Australian politics was, of course, the Australian Labor Party. The Catholic Church actually led the fight against communism. A person whose significance is still felt in the church today, Bob Santamaria, and the movement. A history that you should take some time if you ever get a chance to read. But again, it was part of this whole self-survival. A couple of writers have written intriguing insight into the Catholic Church in Australia. It was just, again, like the rest of this Catholic Church throughout the world, not wanting to face the bigger issues that in European history of the 20th century, Christian Europe twice tried to destroy itself and the rest of the world with it, and very nearly survived. Successfully destroyed European Judaism. It was a long time coming, but a remarkable man, Angelo Roncalli, who during the Second World War had been an apostolic nuncio, one of the diplomatic corps within the Vatican. He served a time as the Roman papal representative in Paris, so he had actually dealings with the Nazis in occupied France and dealing with the Vichy government, which is, as you know, would have been the puppet Nazi government in France. It was with that experience, that sense of diplomacy, but again what I just said before, deep down, all the Christian churches of Europe had to face the critique of history, the judgment day of history, that Europe had basically destroyed itself and 53 to 55 million people. You had Catholic Lutheran Germany and Catholic Italy at war with Catholic France, Catholic Protestant Belgium and the Netherlands, the Anglican Church of England, and the Orthodox Russia. Interestingly enough, in response to that, Vatican II, and it's now 50 years since its first session in 1962, only now are you starting to read, with the power of hindsight, that Vatican II was actually the first meeting of North, South, East and West. Now again, historians or students will say to you, or to people who write those comments, oh, what about the League of Nations? No, it was basically a collection of the colonial powers. What about the United Nations, formulated by one great Australian internationalist, Doc Evatt, in 1948? Was that when the United Nations established? 48? Yeah. No, again, it was a meeting of the victors. China, Communist China, was not part of the early stages of the United Nations. And right through the 1950s into the 60s, the history of the Vietnam War tells us of European powers trying to reclaim their colonial empire. France in Italy, France in Vietnam, the Dutch in Indonesia. Interestingly enough, though, we can't avoid this fact that when Angelo Roncalli, Pope John the 23rd, eventually, with great resistance, got Vatican II, and of course students will say, ah yes, what about Vatican I? Well, Terry mentioned Vatican I at the end of the 19th century, and its agenda was a Pope's agenda. It wasn't a vision, it was a papal agenda. But Vatican II mysteriously was this remarkable meeting of the North, South, East and West in human history. Even today, the United Nations would be there as that world governance. But again, Vatican II, 1962 to 65, points to a high watermark in the sadness of 20th century history. And we have just a shot there from clip art of that remarkable man. He was as round as he was tall. He was once asked, you know, how many people work in the Vatican? He said about half. A remarkable human man. And an interesting thing, he always claimed to be of Italian peasant stock. God love him. Then there are two mysterious characters there in suit and tie. One, Joseph Ratzinger, and the other, Karl Rahner. We'll be discussing them next week. But just for the end here, I just want to focus on that person there in the streets of Rome. Again, just a clip art shot of the Vatican. And there's the person turning his back on the church. How did that come about? Well, again, the fights and the powers that we've seen within the tension between a Platonic and Aristotelian approach, we are left with this image that, yes, the Pope, the bishops and priests and the laity, basically 1700 years of structure. Vatican II, you'd have to almost go back to the Council of Jerusalem to find its structure. Vatican II placed the council, an ecumenical council, a universal council, at the top for, sadly, basically just those brief few years. The Pope was brought down to a level with the bishops, and that's significant both in church ecclesiology, study of the church's own self-understanding, and even sacramentally. Peter without the 11, or the 11 without Peter. Vatican II brought them together for a brief time. But also remarkably, sacramentally within particularly Catholic and Anglican theology, and Uniting Church is now using the documents of Vatican II to look at its own structure, including Roman canon law. But there was an interesting time there in Vatican II where the laity and the priesthood were seen to be collaborating, possibility sharing ministry, the common priesthood finding ground with the sacramental priesthood. Fascinating areas. Strangely enough, one of the weaknesses of Vatican II, it didn't move or didn't codify that relationship in document. So that's why we still see the laity and the priests there possibly working in the vineyard together for a brief period. But remarkably, the end result of 62-65, this meeting of north, south, east and west, the actual turning of the Platonic approach to that remarkable Aristotelian approach of putting everything in the mix together. And we heard these beautiful words like people of God, pilgrim church, a church on a journey, as opposed to the structure of the perfect society or the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire. And this was the remarkable thing, that the priests and the religious orders, the nuns, the brothers, the priests, the teaching orders, the nursing orders, all bets were off. They were put into that whirlpool of action event. And the end result was the church reaching out to the world. More importantly, the church in the world. So it's taken us 2 hours today, possibly a month of lectures and reading for you. And we're in good company because it's taken 1900 years to get to that point. I think I will close there and just let you've got the future slides, so we'll revisit them from the beginning of the lecture next week, Dano. Yeah. But I ask you to reflect on the readings and just to see that dramification, that it has taken us this long to get to that point, that whirlpool of events which landed the church in the world, or as Terry inferred to us, Bonhoeffer could have been there at Vatican II and saying, yes, a religious, a church without religion. Vatican II's dream, the highest level of authority, taking its sanctus from the Council of Jerusalem. But thank you for being with us this afternoon. It's been a bit of a theatrical show up the front here. We just need a stage manager to just do our cues a bit better, but I think we're all right. And again, thanks to those online for bearing with just the long few little bits of dead air as we change microphones. So all the best to those online from us here face to face at good old Newcastle, Australia. Thanks, Terry.